There is a moment in every story when someone tries to close a door just as another heart is finally ready to walk through it. Imagine that moment happening tonight. A message appears on a phone screen, only a few words long, but heavy enough to make the person holding it stop breathing for a second. Don't watch this. No explanation. No apology. No reason. Just those 4 words from the person whose name has been quietly living inside your thoughts. And in this fictional spiritual story, that warning is not about danger. It is about something far more difficult to face, the truth about why they have been pulling away. So before you decide that their silence means they no longer care, stay with this story, because the next discovery changes what those words actually meant. Picture the room around you becoming strangely quiet. The glow from the screen reflects against the window while the rest of the world continues outside, cars passing, distant voices, a dog barking somewhere down the street. Yet inside, everything feels suspended. You read the message again. Don't watch this. Your first thought is simple: what did I do? Your second thought is worse: what are they afraid I will discover? The mind has a cruel habit of filling empty spaces with painful answers, especially when someone we love refuses to explain themselves. But this story begins with a secret that your soulmate has not yet found the courage to tell you. The thing they are trying to hide is not another person, not betrayal, and not a loss of love. It is something they discovered about themselves while trying to understand why they could never fully let you go. For weeks, they had been carrying a private conflict that nobody else could see. They went through ordinary days wearing an ordinary expression, answering questions, laughing when expected, moving through crowded rooms as though nothing inside them had changed. But whenever your name appeared, something shifted. Their fingers would pause above the screen. Their breathing would change. Sometimes they would begin typing a message and erase it before sending. Sometimes they would open an old photograph, stare at it for several seconds, and then lock the phone as if the image had said something they were not ready to hear. What could possibly make a person miss someone this deeply and still choose distance? One evening, they found themselves sitting alone beneath the pale light of a kitchen lamp. A cup of coffee had gone cold beside them. Rain tapped softly against the glass. They opened a conversation with you and began writing the sentence they had rehearsed 100 times: I need to tell you something. They stopped. Deleted it. Tried again. I never stopped caring about you. Deleted that too. Then finally, with trembling honesty, they typed something completely different: I'm scared of what happens if I come back. Their thumb hovered over send. And that was when the real struggle began. Because returning to you would mean confronting the part of themselves they had spent years avoiding. What if love had not been the problem at all? The fictional story takes an unexpected turn here. Your soulmate had recently encountered something that reminded them of you in a way they could not dismiss. It was not a mystical sign appearing in the sky or some impossible coincidence. It was something painfully ordinary, a conversation with an older relative who asked one innocent question. Who is the person you still think about when everything gets quiet? They laughed at first. They tried to change the subject. But the room became silent, and suddenly there was nowhere left to hide. Your soulmate realized they had been measuring every new connection against a memory they had never properly released. And for the first time, they wondered whether walking away from you had actually brought them peace or merely taught them how to live with an unanswered question. That question followed them into the night. They opened a video they had saved weeks earlier but never watched. The title reminded them of something you once said during a conversation, something they had dismissed at the time. They pressed play. Within seconds, their expression changed. They leaned closer to the screen. The words they heard were not specifically about you, yet they struck an old wound with startling precision. It spoke about people who confuse emotional protection with emotional healing. People who convince themselves they are moving on, when they are actually becoming experts at avoiding one unresolved truth. Your soulmate paused the video. Then came the message. Don't watch this. They sent it to you almost immediately. But the strange thing was that they regretted sending it before the message had even delivered. Why would someone warn you away from something they themselves had just watched? Because there was another layer. The video had included a story about two people separated not because they stopped loving one another, but because one person believed they were unworthy of being loved without first becoming perfect. That sentence struck your soulmate harder than anything else. Suddenly, memories they had buried began returning not as dramatic flashes, but as tiny moments. Your patience when they were difficult. The time you noticed their silence without forcing them to speak. The night you stayed awake listening when they insisted they were fine. The small kindnesses they had never thanked you for. And then they remembered the moment they hurt you. Not the argument itself. The expression on your face afterward. That was the memory they could never outrun. Their hands began shaking as they looked at the screen. They realized something they had been too proud to admit. Every time they pushed you away, part of them was secretly hoping you would prove them wrong and stay. But every time you respected their distance, they interpreted it as confirmation that they were finally losing you. How could two people care so much and still misunderstand each other so completely? Meanwhile, you knew none of this. All you knew was that the person you loved had suddenly told you not to watch something. And that uncertainty began turning into a story of its own. Maybe they were hiding something terrible. Maybe they had moved on. Maybe someone else had entered their life. Maybe the message was the final sign that you should stop hoping. But fictional stories often become most powerful at the exact moment the audience believes they already understands what is happening. Because while you were interpreting their warning as rejection, your soulmate was sitting alone trying to gather enough courage to confess something entirely different. They opened your conversation again. This time, they typed. I said don't watch it because. They stopped. The cursor blinked. They stared at those unfinished words for nearly a minute. Then they continued. Because I realized I was the person standing in the way of us. They did not send it. Instead, they placed the phone face down and covered their eyes with both hands. There was no dramatic music. No miracle. No sudden transformation. Just one human being finally confronting a truth they had spent too long avoiding. And then they remembered something you once told them. You had said, I don't need you to have everything figured out. I just need you to be honest with me. At the time, they had smiled and changed the subject. Now those words felt completely different. Because honesty would require them to admit why they left. It would require them to explain the fear behind their distance. And most frightening of all, it would require them to tell you what they discovered when they were finally alone with their own heart. They picked up the phone again. There was one more message waiting to be written. This one could change everything. Their finger moved slowly across the screen. I need you to know that when I told you not to watch that. They paused. Outside, the rain had stopped. The room was completely silent. Then they typed the words they had been afraid to say since the day they walked away. I wasn't trying to keep you from the truth about me. They swallowed hard. I was trying to keep you from discovering how much I still. The sentence remained unfinished. And just before they could complete it, another notification appeared on their screen, one that had nothing to do with you, but contained a piece of information that could force them to finally reveal the real reason they had disappeared. Their eyes widened. They whispered your name. Because the message they had just received contained something from their past that they believed had been gone forever. And suddenly, the warning they sent you "Don't watch this" was no longer about a video at all. It was about what would happen if you discovered who had been quietly influencing their decisions all along. They opened the message. They read the first line. And for the first time in months, your soulmate understood that the story between you had never actually ended. It had only been interrupted. But what they saw next threatened to explain exactly why. My beloved child. The first line on the screen was enough to make your soulmate sit completely still. I think you deserve to know what really happened. For several seconds, they did not move. The words seemed almost too simple compared with the weight they carried. Their thumb remained above the screen while an old memory began unfolding in their mind, not the memory of your last conversation, but one from much earlier, when everything between you had still felt possible. There had been a person in their life who constantly told them that certain relationships were too complicated, that some connections were better left in the past, that protecting themselves meant refusing to become emotionally dependent on anyone. Your soulmate had listened because the advice sounded reasonable, mature, responsible. But now they could see the difference between advice and influence. Someone had been quietly teaching them to distrust their own feelings. And suddenly, the warning they had sent you made sense. They had not been afraid of what you would discover about them. They had been afraid you would discover how easily they had allowed someone else's voice to become louder than their own heart. The person who sent the message knew things about your relationship that should never have been known. Private conversations. Old misunderstandings. Details your soulmate had only shared with someone they trusted. The realization landed with a strange kind of sadness. They had spent months believing their distance was entirely their own decision. Now they wondered how many of those decisions had actually been shaped by someone else's fear. Their eyes moved down the screen. The next message said, "You were never the problem." Your soulmate closed their eyes. That sentence hurt more than an accusation could have. Because somewhere inside, they had spent a long time believing that if they could convince themselves you were the reason everything became complicated, they would finally stop missing you. It had been easier to blame timing. Easier to blame circumstances. Easier to say that the connection had simply become too difficult. But truth has a way of becoming heavier when a person stops running from it. They remembered the day they chose distance. You had not demanded anything. You had not threatened to leave. You had not asked for impossible promises. You had simply looked at them and said, "Tell me what you actually want." They had looked away. That was the moment they understood now. They had not walked away because they knew they didn't want you. They walked away because they were terrified that admitting they did want you would require them to change. And change meant losing the identity they had built around being emotionally untouchable. Across town, you were still holding your phone. You had read the original warning more times than you wanted to admit. Yet something inside you resisted the urge to immediately answer. For once, you did not chase the explanation. You waited. That small decision mattered more than you realized. Because while your soulmate expected you to demand answers, your silence forced them to face a question they had avoided for months. What would they say if you gave them no opportunity to hide behind an argument? They began typing again. "I owe you the truth." Then they stopped. Deleted it. Typed. "I was wrong." Deleted that too. Finally, they wrote something more vulnerable. "I thought losing you would make me stronger." Their breathing became uneven. But it only showed me what I had been afraid to admit. They sent it. This time, they did not put the phone down. They waited for the response. Nothing. 1 minute. 2. 5. And with every passing second, the silence became its own answer. Your soulmate began imagining that you had finally decided not to respond. For the first time, they understood what it felt like to be on the other side of uncertainty. And that was when another memory surfaced. A morning when you had asked them why they kept checking their phone. They had laughed. You had laughed too. Neither of you knew that underneath that ordinary moment was a person terrified of how much they cared. Your soulmate suddenly realized that you had probably noticed far more than they ever admitted. You had seen the hesitation. You had noticed the unfinished sentences. You had felt the distance before they ever explained it. And yet you had never humiliated them for it. That realization broke through something inside them. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like a locked room finally receiving light beneath the door. They opened the conversation with the person who had influenced them. There were years of messages. Advice. Warnings. Opinions. Subtle comments about you. At first, they seemed harmless. Then your soulmate began reading them in a different way. Be careful. Don't get too attached. You don't know what this person really wants. You'll regret trusting them. You're seeing what you want to see. The messages had never sounded openly cruel. That was what made them so powerful. They had been disguised as concern. And suddenly your soulmate understood the deeper wound. Someone had not needed to convince them that you were bad. They only needed to make them uncertain. Uncertainty had done the rest. Every beautiful moment became suspicious. Every misunderstanding became evidence. Every silence became a warning. Every act of love became something they questioned. Until eventually, they convinced themselves that leaving was the safest choice. Your soulmate scrolled farther. Then they found something they had completely forgotten. A message sent shortly before the relationship ended. It contained a screenshot. Their heart stopped. The screenshot was from a conversation involving you. But there was something wrong with it. One sentence had been removed. Another had been rearranged. The context had been changed. It looked convincing at first glance. It had looked convincing back then too. But now your soulmate knew the original conversation. They remembered what you had actually said. Someone had altered the evidence. Someone had wanted them to believe you had said something you never said. They stared at the screen for a long time. Then they whispered, "No." The room suddenly felt smaller. All those months of guilt. All those nights wondering whether they had made the right decision. All those moments when they believed you had not cared enough. A piece of the foundation beneath those beliefs had just collapsed. But there was something even more painful. They realized they had never asked you for your side of the story. They had simply believed what they were shown. That was the part they could barely forgive themselves for. Not the separation. Not the silence. Not even the fear. The fact that they had trusted a version of events without giving the person they loved the dignity of answering. Their phone slipped from their hand onto the table. For several seconds, they stared at nothing. Then they stood. They walked toward the window. The city lights stretched across the glass like scattered stars. And for the first time, they understood that the biggest obstacle between you had never been distance. It had been a story. A story someone else had helped them believe. But stories can be rewritten when the truth finally arrives. They returned to the phone. There was still no response from you. So they made a decision. They would stop sending carefully worded messages. No more half-confessions. No more hints. No more waiting for the perfect moment. They would tell you everything. Their fingers moved quickly now. "I owe you an apology." They continued. "I believed something about you without asking you. Then I let someone else's fear become my judgment." Then came the sentence that required the most courage. "I left because I thought I was protecting myself, but I was actually protecting the lie I had accepted." They stared at it. Their eyes filled. They pressed send. This time, they expected nothing. But then your phone lit up. You looked at the screen. Their name appeared. For a moment, you simply watched it. You could feel your heartbeat change. Not because you knew what the message would say, but because some part of you understood that this was different. You opened it. You read the apology. Then another message appeared. "I found something." A pause. Then, "Something that proves the story I believed about you wasn't the whole truth." Your breath caught. You read the next line. "I don't know if you can forgive me." Then another message appeared immediately. "But before you decide anything, there is one thing you need to see." An attachment appeared beneath it. Your finger hovered over the screen. You recognized the file name. It was connected to a day you had almost completely forgotten. A day when everything between you had changed. A day you had always believed ended because your soulmate made a choice. But now, looking at the attachment, you realized there might have been another reason. You opened it. The screen went dark for a second. Then an old recording appeared. Your soulmate was not in the recording. Neither were you. But the voice you heard belonged to someone who had been present during the most important turning point in your story. And the first sentence from that recording made your heart drop. They don't know what I did yet. You stopped breathing. Because suddenly, the mystery was no longer about why your soulmate left. It was about who had made sure they believed they had to. And somewhere on the other side of the city, your soulmate was listening to the same recording, realizing that the next few minutes could destroy the carefully constructed explanation they had lived with for months. Then the recording continued. And the voice said your name. My beloved child. The recording continued. For several seconds, neither of you heard anything except the faint sound of movement in the background. Then the voice returned, quieter this time. I told them what I wanted them to believe. Your soulmate froze. You stared at the screen. The voice belonged to the person who had once presented themselves as someone trying to help. Someone who claimed to understand your soulmate better than anyone else. Someone who had offered advice when emotions became complicated. But now the recording revealed something completely different. I thought if they believed the relationship was impossible, they would finally stop going back. A pause. They kept talking about you. Your soulmate lowered their head. The voice continued. They weren't ready to let you go. That sentence carried more weight than all the others. Because it revealed what your soulmate had been too frightened to admit even to themselves. They had never truly stopped choosing you in their heart. They had simply been persuaded to stop acting on it. You listened as the recording explained how certain conversations had been selectively repeated, how innocent words had been presented without context, how assumptions had been turned into certainty. Nothing had happened exactly as your soulmate remembered. The story had been edited. And your soulmate had accepted the edited version because believing it was easier than confronting their own fear. Then came the sentence that changed everything. I knew they would regret leaving you. Your soulmate closed their eyes. The recording ended. Silence filled the room. There was no dramatic revelation waiting behind it. No secret villain suddenly appearing. No perfect explanation that could erase months of hurt. Instead, there was something much more human. Responsibility. Your soulmate finally understood that even though another person had influenced the situation, the final decisions had still belonged to them. They could not blame someone else for every choice. They had participated. They had remained silent. They had assumed instead of asking. They had allowed fear to make decisions that love deserved to make honestly. And that realization became the beginning of their healing. Not because everything could instantly return to the way it had been. It couldn't. Too much had happened. Too many quiet nights had passed. Too many unanswered questions had gathered between you. But something essential had changed. For the first time, your soulmate was no longer asking, how do I get them back? They were asking, How do I become honest enough to deserve another conversation? That difference mattered. They picked up the phone. They began typing. Then stopped. They deleted everything. Instead, they called. Your phone rang. You looked at the name. For a moment, your hand remained still. Then you answered. Neither of you spoke. You could hear their breathing. They could hear yours. And somehow, that silence said more than all the messages had. Finally, they whispered, I owe you the truth. You said nothing. They continued. I spent so long trying to explain why I left that I never admitted the real reason. Their voice cracked. I was afraid. Not afraid of you. Afraid of what loving you required. They told you about the messages. The altered screenshot. The conversations taken out of context. The person who had influenced their decisions. But they also told you something more difficult. I could have asked you. You closed your eyes. I should have asked you. That was the apology you had needed. Not an excuse. Not a performance. Not a promise that everything would suddenly become perfect. Just accountability. Your soulmate took a slow breath. I can't ask you to forget what happened. You remained quiet. I can't ask you to trust me immediately. Their voice softened. And I won't ask you to return to the past. That sentence surprised you. Because you had expected them to ask for another chance. Instead, they said, if there is ever another chapter for us, I want it to be built differently. For the first time, the future did not feel like something either of you needed to force. It felt like a door that could remain closed until both people were ready to open it honestly. You finally spoke. You should have told me. I know. You should have trusted me enough to ask. I know. And I can't promise you anything tonight. There was a long silence. Then your soulmate answered. I understand. That answer carried a strange peace. Because once upon a time, they would have argued. They would have defended themselves. They would have tried to convince you. Now they simply listened. And perhaps that was the first real proof that something inside them had changed. The conversation lasted much longer than either of you expected. There were tears. There were uncomfortable truths. There were memories neither of you had spoken about in years. You discovered that some of your assumptions had also been wrong. They discovered that some of your silence had never meant indifference. And slowly, painfully, the story became less about who was right and more about what both of you had failed to say. By the time the call ended, nothing was magically repaired. But something had been restored. Truth. And truth gave both of you something fear had taken away. Choice. You were no longer trapped inside an old misunderstanding. Your soulmate was no longer trapped inside an old version of themselves. The next morning, there was no grand declaration. No impossible promise. Just a simple message. Good morning. Thank you for listening. You smiled. Then came another. I don't know what happens next. A few seconds passed. But I finally feel like I can let what happens next be real. That was enough. Because real love does not always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives quietly, after two people finally stop pretending they are unaffected. Sometimes healing begins with one honest sentence. Sometimes the miracle is not getting exactly what you wanted. Sometimes the miracle is discovering that the truth gives you freedom to choose what comes next. And if this fictional story has found a place in your heart, remember this: you do not have to chase someone to prove that you are worthy of being loved. You do not have to force an answer from someone who is not ready to speak. And you do not have to carry responsibility for every misunderstanding that happened between you and another person. Let people reveal themselves through their actions. Let honesty become the foundation. Let time expose what fear tried to hide. And if two hearts are meant to walk toward each other again, let them do so with open eyes, clearer boundaries, and a deeper understanding than they had before. Your worth was never determined by whether someone stayed. Your value was never reduced because someone became confused. And your future does not become smaller because one chapter ended differently than you hoped. There are still beautiful pages waiting to be written. So tonight, wherever you are, may you be given peace where your mind has been restless. May you receive courage where uncertainty has made you hesitate. May your heart release the questions it cannot answer today. May the people who truly value you learn to communicate with honesty. And may every relationship meant to remain in your life become stronger through truth rather than fear. May you never mistake silence for your lack of worth. May you never believe that you must beg to be chosen. And may the love that reaches you, whether it is renewed, transformed, or completely unexpected, meet you with respect, clarity, and sincerity. If someone from your past returns, may you have the wisdom to look beyond their words and recognize the change in their actions. If someone does not return, may you have the strength to understand that their absence does not mean your story is over. And if you are standing at the beginning of a new chapter, may you walk into it without carrying the weight of an old one. Because the deepest ending in this story was never about losing someone. It was about losing the fear that had kept two people from telling the truth. And perhaps that is why the warning began with, "Don't watch this." Because sometimes the thing we are most afraid to see is not a painful truth about someone else. It is the truth about ourselves. Your soulmate had to discover that they were not protecting their heart. They were hiding from it. And once they finally stopped hiding, the choice became simple. Not easy. Not guaranteed. But honest. The story ends with two people standing on opposite sides of a new beginning, neither pretending to know what tomorrow will bring. And for the first time, neither of them is afraid of finding out. So take a breath. Release what you cannot control. Keep what is genuine. And trust yourself enough to recognize the difference. If this message gave you something meaningful to think about, stay connected to this channel for more inspirational stories about love, healing, hope, and the unexpected turns life can take. And if someone you care about needs to hear these words tonight, share this message with them. May peace find you. May clarity guide you. May your heart become lighter. And may the next chapter of your life bring you closer to the kind of love that never requires you to lose yourself just to keep it. Amen.